In this series, we're answering the question, what is the gospel? We said that the gospel is the good news story of God and creation, a story by God about how God is light, life, and love, and a story that invites us to partner with God as he makes a way for creation to come back to life in his very goodness. So let's jump back into the story. In our last video, we heard the story of how God created the world. And from that story, we learned the truth that very goodness comes from God. We also learned that when humanity lives in the light of this truth, we can live the lives of self-sacrifice, forgiveness, and rest we were made for. Next, we heard the story of how humanity lost sight of the truth when a serpent tricked humanity into believing a big lie, the lie that humanity has to make their own very goodness. We saw that when humans try to make their own very goodness, we are self-serving and unforgiving and endlessly striving for a very good life that we can never make for ourselves. And we called that mode of living sin. So next we heard how God made a plan to inspire humans to trust him again. God's plan was to partner with a human family called Israel to bless the world by sharing God's very goodness. We learned that this partnership deal, the covenant, was made possible by God's unique forever and no matter what love, a love where God covers both sides of the deal. So here's what happens next. Today, we pick up the gospel story in Egypt, where Israel ended up settling at the end of Genesis, and where we see that things are going really well for Israel for about 4 sentences. Here's what happened. While they were in Egypt, Israel's population totally exploded. And the problem was, the Egyptians totally noticed. Egypt realized that if they didn't do something soon, they were going to be outnumbered by these foreigners. And since Egypt was absolutely bamboozled by the lie that humanity has to make their own very goodness, they were willing to do anything to secure theirs. And that's why Egypt enslaved the Israelites and murdered their children for 400 years. As you can imagine, this was not great for God's big plan to bless the whole world through Israel. First of all, Israel couldn't shine the light of God's very goodness all over the world if they were stuck in Egypt. This meant God was going to need to deliver Israel from Egypt to the place they really needed to be, a place Scripture calls the Promised Land. But also, 400 years in slavery will really do a number on your mind and heart. God was going to have to remind Israel what it means to live in his very goodness, because they hadn't experienced any goodness in a really long time. So God needed to get Israel out of Egypt, and then to get Egypt out of Israel. And this is how he did it. First, God needed someone to lead Israel out of Egypt, to relocate Israel to the land God had promised Abraham. And a guy named Moses was exactly the right dude for the job. Very long story, very short, God worked it out so that Moses had a kind of weird upbringing. You see, Moses was born to a Hebrew family, but raised in the Egyptian palace. And one day, the weirdness of Moses' identity got him into some serious trouble. And he ended up running for his life away from Egypt. For the next 40 years, Moses built a whole new life. He got married and he had kids and he worked as a shepherd. But God had a job for Moses in Egypt. So one day while Moses was out doing shepherding stuff, God appeared to Moses as a burning bush. God told Moses that he had heard the cries of Israel's suffering and that he was going to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians, and that Moses was going to be the guy who actually went to Pharaoh to set the plan in motion. Now, Moses wasn't exactly convinced that this was going to work, but he trusted God enough to go back to Egypt, and he trusted God enough to go to Pharaoh. And this does not go well. Moses delivers the message from God to Pharaoh to let my people go. And in response, Pharaoh was like, no thanks. Now, God is certainly powerful enough to just immediately strike down Pharaoh, or even all of the Egyptians that day, and set Israel free. But that is not how the God of light, life, and love works. Our God offers very goodness. So instead, God gave Egypt like 10 chances to change their mind. Pharaoh kept saying no, and every time Pharaoh said no, God would send a literal plague to Egypt to let Pharaoh know who he was messing with. Things like lice and frogs and locusts and boils and 3 days of total darkness, but Pharaoh wasn't having it. Finally, when God was sure Pharaoh would not change his mind, God sent the last plague, and it was a doozy. The plague caused the death of the firstborns all over Egypt. And this is what finally got Pharaoh's attention. He told Israel to get up and go, and they did. But there was still a problem. You see, when you are living the lie that you have to make your own very goodness, you can't escape the cycle of sin until you've put your trust in God, which Pharaoh did not do. So unbelievably, Pharaoh changed his mind again, and he sent the Egyptian army to chase after Israel to the edge of the sea. Understandably, Israel freaked out, but God gave Moses the power to literally part the sea, and Israel was able to walk through the water on dry ground. Once they had safely crossed, the water unparted itself, and the Egyptian army drowned in the sea. And that's how God delivered Israel from Egypt, through the water into new life. But delivering Israel out of Egypt was the easy part. Now God had to get Egypt out of Israel. After 400 years in slavery, Israel needed to learn to rely on God's very goodness. Remember God's promise to stick with them forever and no matter what, and to live totally different from the rest of the world. And this is how he did it. First, Israel learned to rely on God as the source of very goodness. It was great to be out of Egypt and all, but now these 12 tribes of Israel were wandering in the desert. They needed God to provide drinkable water, and so God provided just enough drinkable water for everyone. They needed God to provide food, and so God provided just enough bread and meat for everyone every morning. They needed God to show them their next step forward, and God appeared as a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of smoke during the day. Through it all, Israel was not perfect, and learning to trust was not easy. But through their wandering in the desert, Israel learned that they didn't have to hoard or fight or strive endlessly. In the desert, they learned to rest in the promise that God would always give them enough to make it through the day. You could say that Israel learned to trust that God would give them this day their daily bread. Next, Israel needed to be reminded of the covenant promise between God and his people. Remember that it was the promise of God, made in blood, to stick with Israel forever and no matter what, and to cover both sides of their deal, that enabled Israel to keep returning to God's very goodness even when they made big mistakes. So God wanted to make sure that this new generation of Israelites was in on the promise. After they'd been wandering for 40 days, God brought Israel to Mount Sinai to make them an offer. He told Israel that if they obeyed him, that he would make them his treasured possession, which, by the way, was essentially like God offering marriage-level faithfulness to this whole group of people. And Israel was like, sign us up. But literally, while God and Moses were up on the mountain nailing down the terms of this new deal, Israel made a statue of a golden calf and worshipped it instead of God. Ooh. Which is basically like the bride cheating on the groom at the wedding reception. Now, this betrayal mattered to God, and he might have walked away, but God had made a promise to Abraham. A promise of forever and no matter what. A promise to cover both sides of the deal. And so God did not give up on Israel. And by not giving up on them, he reminded them of his promise, and he showed them his faithfulness to it. So Israel had relearned to rely on God for very goodness and been reminded of God's promise, and now they just needed to get used to being a little upside down. If Israel was going to stand out as something different in the world, they were going to need to live in a way that was strange enough to get the world's attention. So God gave them a code of conduct for how to live differently as a kingdom of priests. And because the point of this code was to make Israel stand out, between you and me, some of the things in this code were pretty wild. But the point was the people of Israel, as God's human partners in saving creation, were not meant to live like everyone else. They had to learn a way of existing that seemed totally upside down. And so Israel spent 40 years like this, wandering in the desert, learning to rely on God, remembering the promise of God, and practicing being upside down. But it was not the plan to keep Israel isolated in the desert forever. You can't pass the cake if you never go to the party. And so God was about to plant Israel in the land he had promised them. Obviously, to Israel, this sounded great, but there was a danger with the next step of the plan. The danger was that when Israel entered the promised land, they were going to be surrounded by nations who were living the lie, fighting and competing and striving to make their own very goodness. And that meant that there was a real danger that Israel would forget to be upside down, forget God's promise, and try to make their own very goodness. So if this mission was going to work, if Israel was going to bless the nations by showing them a new way of life, if Israel was actually going to be able to pass the cake, they were going to need to remember where they came from. Because God knew if they forgot what it felt like to be slaves in Egypt, they were in danger of becoming a new Egypt. They were in danger of becoming the lie they were chosen to expose. And that would not be very good news for anyone.